Saturday, April the 27th, 1968, the bat mitzvah of Judith Frischberg. Now, Judith Frischberg, would you please come to the bima so that I can have the pleasure of presenting you with the Bible on behalf of the Women's Division of the Society of the Advancement of Judaism. It only seems yesterday that Susan was up here. It only seems the day before that David was up here. One of us must be getting old, but it looks better on you. Scriptures say the threefold cord shall not be broken. So I suppose this is a kind of a threefold bat mitzvah celebration. We finally wrapped up this chapter of the family's life, and of course we hope that there will be many, many more simchas in years to come. We could have given you a copy of the Talmud, or a copy of the Midrash, or a copy of the Mishnah, or any other of the books that I hope one day you will be looking into, but we chose the Bible because it happens to be one of the earliest and the most sacred of our traditional texts, central to Jewish life. Your name doesn't appear in this book. Oh, it does, but not in its main characterization as the Judith. I imagine you must have been named after a member of the family, is that right? A member of the family. But there is a Judith, not in the Bible, but in a collection of books which were not regarded as sacred enough or important enough to be included in the Bible, known as the Apocrypha. And there is a special book called the Book of Judith. I'm sure you know about this. Do you know what she did? No? Well, this was a very remarkable woman. The Jews were fighting. The Jews always seem to be fighting somewhere, somehow. And the Jews were fighting, I think, with the Assyrians. And the men couldn't do anything. They were absolutely hopeless. They couldn't, and the Assyrians were almost there at the front of the Jerusalem. They're going to destroy Jerusalem. And Judith had a wonderful idea. She put on her best Shabbos clothes, and she got a large bottle of scotch, and she went through the lines to the tent of the brigadier, the general of the Assyrians. And after about the 15th glass of scotch, he forgot what was going on. She pulled out his sword and she cut his head off. And then she put it on a big plate, I hope it was a fleshig plate, and she carried it back to Jerusalem and presented it in front of the beleaguered city. And all the soldiers on the wall cheered so loud that the Assyrians were more frightened than all their previous efforts. And they rushed into Holofernes' tent. This was the name of the poor man who lost his head because he drank too much. And they found that Holofernes was there minus his head. And so they ran away, and that's how Jerusalem was saved, by a woman by the name of Judith. Now, I don't want to say you have a lot to live up to, but certainly perhaps some kind of strategy vis-a-vis President Nasser would be more successful than the whole weight and might of the Israeli Defense Forces thus far. But I do want to draw to your attention, Judith, that in our sacred tradition, women play a very important role. Now, during the medieval period, when the Jews were oppressed and they were forced back on themselves and they didn't have very much to do, the men began to throw their weight around. And so if you just think of the medieval period, you get the impression that only the men are important in Jewish life. And today, there are many synagogues where women are still made to play the kind of role they played during the medieval period, when the Jews didn't have much to do because they were persecuted by the outside world, so the men threw their weight around. But if you go back behind the medieval period to the classical chapters of our history, you will find that women played most important roles, whether running the household or cutting off the heads of naughty generals who attempted to destroy Jerusalem. And the Bible is full of women who distinguished themselves in this fashion. Now, of course, with serious qualifications. I hope you will follow in their footsteps. I hope you will show vigor, perseverance, courage, and bravery in being the full meaning of your name, which is not only Yehudit, meaning Judith, but the original meaning, of course, is simply Jewess, a Jewess. Be a Yehudit in the spirit not only of Yehudit of the Apocrypha, but of all those fine women who cast such luster on the history of the Jewish people. And just in case you forget, I'm giving you a Bible with the name Judith written on the front. And now we look forward to a continuing, happy, creative, and meaningful association with you over many, many years to come. Mazal Tov. And I would like the whole Lois family now to stand. And the grandparents, please, if they so desire, and anybody else in the family, if they so desire. May he who blessed our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless Judith Frischberg, who has this day been called to the reading of the Torah in token of her desire to live a worthy Jewish life. May God, who was with her from birth and enabled her to grow to her present stature in body and spirit, continue to be with her in the life that is before her. May it be God's will that she continue to grow in health and strength, in wisdom and humility, in love and loyalty, in faith and courage, that she may ever be a joy to her parents, an honor to her people, a credit to her country, and a true servant of God. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechiyanu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Amen. Will the congregation please rise for Kedusha on page 186. Page 186. Our English reading today will be found on page 471 in the prayer book. Page 471 in the prayer book. The role of Eretz Yisrael in Jewish religion. And we read it this morning in commemoration of Israel's 20th anniversary. May the 2nd coming week is Yom Atzmaut, the 20th anniversary of Israel. Our rabbis in the Mishnah give us a timetable in life. At 5 years old, one is supposed to study Chumash. 10 years, one is supposed to study Mishnah. At 13, one becomes obliged to perform the mitzvot and be responsible for them. That is to say, if one fails to obey them, theoretically one is supposed to be punished for not obeying them. At 15, one is supposed to study the Talmud. At 18, one is supposed to get married. Please don't take it too seriously. This was written a long time ago. And Ben Esrim Lirdof, the age of 20, one is supposed to go out and earn a living. Notice that one finishes one's education and gets married and has a family before one goes out and earns a living. Parents, presumably, were supposed to pick up the tabs through all this period. The age of 20, Ben Esrim Lirdof, a man is supposed to go out and earn a living for himself. I don't know how we would translate this about Eretz Yisrael today, Ben Esrim Lirdof. Perhaps translated into the language of the collectivity, it might mean that now is the time for Israel to achieve a favorable balance of payments. And this is, of course, an area where we ourselves are meant to help. I do not wish to spend much time this morning speaking about the gallant Israeli soldiers. I find it very hard to deliver what I call vicarious Zionism sermons. For that kind of schmaltz, there are many synagogues available in Manhattan, and I recommend you to visit them from time to time. You know, we did a wonderful job at the Wailing Wall. We entered Jerusalem and the great victorious Jews. All over the country you can get that kind of vicarious Zionism. I feel very strongly about indulging vicariously in other people's heroism. You must forgive me. It's a failing I have. Being the rabbi, I find it difficult to give what I call the schmaltzy sermons. I'm sure you've heard them. Sometimes they occur at UJA gatherings when I suppose if that's the only way you can elicit money, then schmaltz is acceptable. At this synagogue, we have a long-standing tradition of indulging in other means for extracting money. George Steiner once said that the experience of the concentration camp was so harrowing that anyone who had not been into a concentration camp himself shouldn't stand up and make pious platitudes about the terrible sufferings of the Warsaw Ghetto and the anguish of those who lived and went in Auschwitz. He permitted a man like Elie Wiesel to talk about the concentration camps because Elie Wiesel had been there. But he always felt, George Steiner said, terribly uncomfortable when people who had not been into the concentration camp began to wax eloquent about what it meant to have suffered under the Nazis. And I feel much the same way about Israel. Those who really feel so deeply involved and committed to the Israeli way of life can always take a one-way ticket to Lydda Airport. There are plenty of openings in the Israeli army today. And those who wish to take Zionism that seriously ought to seriously think of doing it in actions and not in words. We who are in this country have several tangible areas in which we can express our concern for Israel. I would like to suggest 2 birthday presents which Israel would love. Firstly, I would like to suggest that we put our bodies where our hearts are tomorrow at 11 o'clock on 5th Avenue. I'm saying this to each and everybody. I know you've all got important things to do tomorrow morning, but I'm suggesting to you that instead of having a warm Jewish heart or a warm Zionist heart, you put your body visibly and physically at 5th Avenue at about 11 o'clock tomorrow, because a lot of non-Jews will be looking out from their windows, and a lot of press reporters will be there, and a lot of photographers will be there, and I think they will be much more impressed by the sign of your beautiful bodies there than any words, feelings, or emotions which you will simply carry with you but nobody will see. And the second way in which something can be done tangibly about Israel is to rapidly reply to the letter which many of you already have received to contribute to the United Jewish Appeal this year. Right now, for a truly happy birthday on the occasion of her 20th anniversary, Israel needs deeds, not words. And through our contribution to the United Jewish Appeal this year, and through our visible, manifest demonstration on behalf of Israel in 5th Avenue tomorrow at the Israel Independence Day Parade, I think we will be doing just about as much tangibly as can be done in America today. Now, I know it hurts to write out a big check, but it doesn't hurt half as much as having a piece of shrapnel in your leg. So we have to choose today, we Jews, either to be in America and suffer one way, or to be in Israel and suffer another way. It's not that I'm averse to words. After all, I gain my living by words. I am averse to that kind of cheap nostalgia and cheap sentiment which speaks volumes and weeps crocodile tears about the suffering of the Jewish people, but does not resolve itself into action and tangible doing and performance on behalf of our brethren in the land of Israel. Now, there are many people in this synagogue this morning who have visited Israel more times than I've been on the Staten Island ferry. So I'm not going to tell them or you what all of you know from Look magazine and from all the other publicism which describes in detail the problems of Israel, which are well known to you. I do ask you, in wishing happy birthday to Israel on her 20th anniversary, to tangibly help Israel to achieve what the Rabbi said should happen at the age of 20, lirdof, to achieve, as I translate it, a favorable balance of payments by involving your own bodies in Israel's public relations and involving your own dollars in supporting the creative and meaningful work on behalf of Israel in your contributions to its welfare this year. And now, in the prayer that I have chosen, we will be reading alternately traditional aphorisms culled from the Bible and culled from rabbinic literature. And through reading these ancient sayings of the rabbis and of the authors of the Bible about the spiritual challenge of Israel, derived from 4,000 years of our history and our tradition, let us rededicate ourselves to the true and meaningful, creative and significant support of Eretz Yisrael. The reading from the prophets this morning, which our Bat Mitzvah read so beautifully, was the account, part of the account, of the dramatic story told in the book of Samuel of David, Jonathan, and Saul. Read specially today because tomorrow, Sunday, is Rosh Chodesh, and the opening words of the reading include Macha Chodesh, tomorrow is the new moon. David, one of the great heroes of our people. What kind of a man was he? We don't know, or rather we should ask, which David? For over the several thousand years of our tradition, we can distinguish three distinct and different Davids functioning in the collective mind of the Jewish people. First, there is what we could call the original biblical David, the primary David. Then there is the secondary biblical David, and thirdly there is the rabbinic David. The primary biblical David may be seen described between the lines in the books of Samuel and in the books of Kings. I say between the lines because the Bible has been subjected to much editing. And in each subsequent editing, the later authors tended to put into the mouths and minds of the earlier heroes ideas which those earlier heroes did not have, but which the later editors felt were more respectable and more appropriate. In other words, they felt that, well, if we had been David, we would have done this. If we had been David, we would have said this. So we have to look between the lines in the books of Samuel and Kings to find out who the real David originally was. It's not too difficult because one can always detect the hands of the later editors. Now, the primary biblical David, the first David, is quite unlike any rabbi you have ever met and quite unlike any pre-modern Jew you have ever met. The nearest thing, in fact, to the primary biblical David is somebody like one of the modern Israeli army types. Perhaps Moshe Dayan would be the nearest thing I can think of to the original David. But even this is not quite exact, because modern Israeli generals are supposed to be more civilized, more sophisticated, and more moral. But the primary biblical David, about whom we read this morning, is almost a pagan. He is certainly not religious in our sense of the word. He is a brilliant strategist, a general, a soldier, physical prowess, highly successful with the ladies, as attested by his incident with Bathsheba, and I doubt if the modern Israeli army would tolerate such behavior. And as for his attitude towards Uriah the Hittite, just because he took a fancy to Bathsheba, he sends this poor fellow to the front line. This kind of behavior would almost certainly in the 20th century lead to a summary court-martial. Some of you may have seen or will be seeing the new musical on Broadway, I'm Solomon. It's a cute musical and enjoyable, but I want to warn you that Solomon, as depicted by the authors of that musical, is much too sophisticated and civilized for the David that I am describing. He's a nice gentleman, and he's much too thoughtful about the people he's pushing around. But David would have had none of that kind of sensitivity. He was a healthy extrovert. Psychiatrists, primary David will never need. Neuroses, primary David will never have. Now, the secondary biblical David peeps through in Samuel and Kings, but does not really come to the fore until much later in the Bible, in the book of Chronicles. This second biblical David is a distinctly religious personality. He is more Oliver Cromwell than Moshe Dayan. Perhaps I should give a brief explanation of why it is that we have two different Davids in the Bible. The Bible, of course, is not just a book. It is a library of books. It is the literary record of our history over a period of 1,000 years. It contains many contradictions, many overlappings, and many duplications. Part of the Bible consists of two almost parallel but different historical versions of Jewish history. One version is found in the books of Samuel and Kings, which is where our reading this morning came from. The other is in a summary of that history in the book of Chronicles, the books of Chronicles. Now, the books of Chronicles are very late. They probably date from about the 3rd pre-Christian century, and the books of Samuel and Kings probably date from the 7th pre-Christian century. And a process of re-editing is at work over all these centuries, which only can be detected in the books of Samuel and Kings, but is very much to be observed in the later books of Chronicles. What is happening is that Israel is ceasing to be a national sovereign state and beginning to be a diaspora people. Now, in a national sovereign state, the kind of people you need and have to rely on are the Moshe Dayans, or is it Moshe Dayanim? When a people is a diaspora people, those are the very people who are dangerous, the people who are always ready to fight back. When you have a diaspora people, you need a certain quality of spiritual leadership in order to tide the people over in the face of the spiritual duress and strain of persecution. A prime example of the difference between the David of the books of Kings and Samuel and the David of the books of Chronicles is that whereas the books of Samuel and Kings give a detailed account of David's affair with Bathsheba, that story is entirely omitted from the recapitulation of that history in the books of Chronicles. Why? Because in the books of Chronicles, the spirit of the editors is manifest. David plays a spiritual role in Israel's development. By that time in the history of our people, all those little sanctuaries scattered up and down Israel had been united in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, conceived of as the city of David. One temple alone was now the place where sacrifices could be offered. And David, as the founder of the cult, could not possibly be described as a man who had committed adultery. And therefore, when the authors of Chronicles wrote the story of the development of Jewish religion, because the people were no longer a people but a church, their leader was now a priest and not a king, and their heroes were now spiritual people and not brilliant strategical pagan warriors. All those events which made David appear a little traif were taken out, and instead David was presented as a shtickle tzaddik. Now, I said that this process of reconstruction is already visible in the books of Samuel and Kings, but not so much that we can't see between the lines what a real earthy David originally was. You know, real He-Man, a toughie. Already we begin to see the shadow of the diaspora descending in the re-editing of those early books of the Bible. And by the time we get to the books of Chronicles, the editing is so complete that large sections of the history of David are already removed. One of the things which Jewish apologists, of whom there are many, who always like to think the Jews are the best of all peoples and the Jews never do anything wrong, one of the arguments of Jewish apologists is that the Bible is a wonderful book because unlike other spiritual books, we're always very proud of the mistakes of our leaders. Just look at the story of David. Tradition was not at all ashamed of the fact that this great king committed adultery and even recorded it. But these apologists forget that later in the Bible there's another version, another attempted history of the Jewish people which tried to stifle that story. We Jews are just as human as any other people, thank God. And the interesting thing is that with all the efforts of the spiritual leaders to try to decontaminate David, as it were, of his earthy reality, they were not successful, and so our Bible presents two parallel versions of David. One, a shtickle tzaddik, which is the later one, and one, the real McCoy, the earlier one. By the way, the ascription of the book of Psalms to King David was part of the process of making of a tzaddik out of Moshe Dayan. In other words, it was felt if a man could write 150 Psalms, he couldn't be such a bad man. Of course, this is a purely theoretical assumption because many of the Psalms, most of them in fact, were written long after the time of King David. But it is interesting to note that the reason why the Psalms are ascribed to the editorship of David is part of the process of trying to make David a mensch, at least a mensch according to the views of the authors of the later sections of the Bible. A question. Since the later spiritual leaders obviously objected to an earthy king, an earthy pagan military general, why didn't the books of Samuel and Kings disappear completely? After all, in the good old days, when under Stalin Russian history was being rewritten, you never had two versions of Stalin side by side. You just had the party line. So why was it that those ancient authors didn't have the courage, since they had the courage to take the story of the adultery out of the books of Chronicles, why didn't they take the books of Samuel and Kings out of the Bible? Very simple. They couldn't. those stories, so entrenched in the hearts of the people, were so beloved by the ballad singers and those who told and retold the story at the city gates, night by night in ancient Judea, could never be silenced. And so our people has always had a glorious flair for inconsistency in the life of the Spirit, and the 20th century is no different, although in Reconstructionism we are trying, without too much success, to resolve some of those discrepancies and inconsistencies. Thus far then, two Davids. The David which I say is the real David, the original David, the general in the Israeli army, only more so. And then the later David, who is the little tzaddik who, God forbid, would commit adultery. No, he is a pious founder of a cult in Jerusalem who always rolled his eyes, davened, and offered sacrifices day in, day out, constantly thinking of God, and certainly not of other people's wives. And now when we get to the period of the rabbis, David is made even into a bigger tzaddik. Now he becomes a rabbi. He is no longer an Israeli general of the caliber of Moshe Dayan, nor a spiritual saint of the caliber of Oliver Cromwell, but a kind of a Vilna Gaon. His musical inclinations, which are already described in the biblical period, now become of the kind of music that you will hear at a conventicle of the Chabad, the Lubavitcher. It's all religious music. The idea that David could have pulled out his guitar and sung a love song epos, this is inconceivable to the rabbis. They considered David, the sweet singer in Israel, as devoting all his musical talents to singing praises to God. The rabbinic David is a Talmud Chacham. And when you put the rabbinic David is described in rabbinic legend next to the biblical David, it is almost impossible to recognize both men as being the same, because the rabbis take David even further than the authors of the books of Chronicles, who simply omitted parts of Samuel and Kings which they didn't want, but the rabbis added certain things. For example, commenting on a verse in Psalm 119, Chatzot laila akum lehodot lach. I get up, O Lord, to give thanks unto thee in the middle of the night. This is said of King David. Over his bed there hung a harp opposite the window of his bedroom. And when midnight came, the north wind would blow through the window of his room, and the harp would begin to play all of its own accord. Immediately, David would get out of bed and study the Torah until the dawn. And when dawn came, all the elders of Israel came to him with questions concerning ritual matters which David spent the whole day deciding. This image of David, as it were, complaining to God in the Midrash, presents us with a remarkable picture. Ribono shel olam, David says, sovereign of the universe, what a wonderful pious king I am. I am not like the other kings of the rest of the peoples in the world. They drive fast cars. They are with the jet set. They go to Truman Capote's parties. They drink dry martinis all night long. But I am paskening shilas all day long. I am devoting myself to the spiritual welfare of the Jewish people. And the harp itself, which in the biblical period is just another dimension of pagan David, he is a strolling guitar player, as it were. In rabbinic literature, the playboy's guitar, with which the biblical David was wont to serenade the wives of other women, has become the scholar's alarm clock. Who was the real David? We don't know. What we do know is that the three different levels of authors who wrote the three different levels of the David story needed David for different reasons. David played a role for three different groups of people in our history. Firstly, there was a time when our people was an ordinary people living on its own soil, struggling for national existence and for physical survival. And that people needed a pagan warrior, a strong man to beat up the Philistines. His morals were his own business. As a matter of fact, on the contrary, the less scrupulous that general was, perhaps the more successful he would be as a general. Generals who are too sensitive about their soldiers dying can no more fight good battles than a surgeon who feels too much personally for his patient can perform a good operation. One suspects that the biblical David, the first biblical David, is closest to the real David. But this is conjecture. Even in the first biblical David, we already have a reconstruction of the original human being. Now, after our people lost its soil and were on the verge of becoming a diaspora people, they felt a desperate need to survive without the usual trappings of military power. And therefore, as the leopard develops its spots, so the Jewish people developed prophets from the 8th century onwards, who were prepared to see in defeat at the hands of the Assyrians and the Babylonians the punishment from God. The Jews were not an ordinary people, subject to ordinary military defeat. Their defeat was punishment from God. And therefore they were exiled from their land because of their sins. And this became a profound ethical motivation to repent and to survive. Under this view, David is no longer a brilliant general. He becomes a central motif in Jewish restoration. The Mashiach, the Messiah who will deliver the Jewish people, is Mashiach ben David. Now, there is nothing messianic about the man who sends Uriah the Hittite to the front in order that he might marry his wife. And yet now, at this third stage in Jewish history, David as a hero is needed to play a new role in the crisis of the removal of political sovereignty from the Jewish people. And this is foreseen by the prophets as early as the 8th pre-Christian century. And the rabbis take this a stage further. David had to be a rabbi. They had to look back on the biblical period and not see David as he was, even for the authors of Chronicles, but as in their own image. The biblical period, which was a national and sovereign and autonomous political period in the history of our people, needed a Moshe Dayan. The ecclesiastical period, when our people was a church under the leadership of priests, needed an Oliver Cromwell, a righteous saint. And the rabbinical period needed a rabbi. Poor, poor real David, whoever you were, God rest your soul, how you were needed by our people in their several successive hours of need. But when we analyze the three different Davids who functioned in the life of our people, we are challenged beyond the theological considerations involved from a purely historical and evolutionary consideration of our people. Just as in our consideration of Eretz Israel, it is so easy to see Israel as over there and us over here, instead of trying to involve ourselves creatively for ourselves right here on this very spot where we stand. And by the same token, in discussing Jewish history, it is so easy to get a nice nostalgic and romantic feeling about hearing a few Hebrew words, learning a little bit of Jewish history, learning a few little things about our people developed in the past, without realizing that every rabbinic legend and every rabbinic story has a potent ethical meaning and significance for us today. The question which comes to my mind when I consider the three levels of King David over the 4,000 years of our history is, granted that in Jewish tradition, the collective Jewish people needed David to go through three different roles, all different from his own original personality and humanity, for Jewish survival, conceded that this was needed for Jewish survival. But what about our relationship with other people and other people's relationship with us? Are we all involved in this business of role playing? Or is there a genuine reciprocity of honesty and authenticity in our relationships? How many friends do we have? Or how many role players do we have? Of whom, for that matter, are we friends? And for whom are we role players? When the ox is down, the rabbis say, many are the slaughterers. They know of the friendship that a rich man has when he has money. But they want to know, when they ask this, What happens when a rich man loses his money? Does he still have the same friends that he had before? Or were his friends somehow bound up with his role as a rich man? Were his friends superimposing upon him a role which was not of himself? A friend in need, we say, is a friend indeed. What about our relationship with other people? For whom would we stick our necks out, standing to gain naught, possibly standing to lose all? And who would thus stick their necks out for us? The poet has observed the need for seeing ourselves as others see us. But do others see us as ourselves? Do they not see us in roles which wait until the testing point of some crisis? Hillel, who summed up the whole of the Torah in the sentence, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," has another comment to make. Do not judge thy neighbor until thou reachest his place. Put yourself into his boots. You cannot judge your neighbor until you can identify with him. Notice that Hillel does not say, do not judge your neighbor until you see him as an other sees him, to see ourselves as others see us. Hillel says we must see others as we see ourselves, deeply empathize and identify with them, making allowances for the human element. However creatively David in his three roles may function in Jewish history, we are presented with a problem to look at our relationships with other people and ask ourselves, to what extent are they dependent upon what we get from those people? And how much would those people have to stop giving us what they are giving us for us to tell them to go and leave us because we have no feeling for them, proving thereby that there was no authentic relationship, but merely a role. We needed them for our own personal, selfish purposes. A father once complained to the Baal Shem Tov, the great leader of Hasidism, that his son had forsaken God. He rushed to the rabbi and said, "My son has forsaken God." What did he want the rabbi to say to him? Perhaps he wanted the rabbi to say to him, "Go home and sit Shiva." Perhaps he wanted the rabbi, the Baal Shem Tov, to say to him, "Go and rewrite your will," and cut him off without a penny. Perhaps the father wanted the Baal Shem Tov to say to the father, "Don't pay any more of his college bills. Throw him out of the home, and then let him see who he needs." Because when anybody asks a rabbi a question, they already have the kind of answer they want. And if the rabbi gives them the answer they want, it's all right. And if the rabbi doesn't give them the answer they want, then they also indicate that they have a role that the rabbi plays. And the price of their relationship with the rabbi is the rabbi giving them the answers they want, but not the answers they don't want. So it's Feldtepes. You see? Only if you give the right answers and preach the right kind of sermons, that is the role. But as soon as that role breaks down, all that has been built up before over centuries of a relationship which one thought was authentic suddenly proves to have been phony and spurious. And I have seen this happening in the world of man far too often, when a man's fortunes decline, when his monies decline, when he becomes sick, when he has to go into hospital, when there is some tragedy in his life, and he doesn't exude the jet-set atmosphere anymore. He doesn't make people feel happy anymore. Maybe he arouses people's consciences too much. And friendship goes out of the window because the role has gone. The father has a problem, because if a father has to come and ask the Baal Shem Tov what he must do with his son who has forsaken God, the father already has a problem with his son, and he wants the rabbi to give him the answer that he wants. He had loved his son in the role of a God follower. The price of his love for his son was that his son should be a lover of God. And as soon as his son stopped loving God, the father had to go to the rabbi because he couldn't cope anymore. And the answer of the Baal Shem Tov to the father who complained that his son had forsaken God and asked what to do, the Baal Shem's reply to the father who complained that his son had forsaken God, "What shall I do?" was, Love him more than ever. Now he needs your love more than ever before. Now that your son has gone off the straight and narrow path, now the acid test is brought to bear on everything that has happened before. Now we will know whether there was an authentic father-son relationship, or whether the price of your love for your son was whether he did what you wanted him to do. And this is a problem with which we are all faced. In the Haftarah of this morning, two kinds of love are described. There is a father and a son, Saul and Jonathan. And there is Jonathan and David, two friends. Jonathan knows that David is going to be the next king of Israel, and that although he is in the succession, David in fact will make the better king, and that this is God's will within the context of the universal discourse of the Bible. Saul also knows this, but Saul wants Jonathan to be the king because Jonathan is his son, and therefore sees this friend of his son Jonathan, David, only in the role of competitor for the throne. And when in our Haftarah this morning, Saul turns to Jonathan and says, "Where is David? Why hasn't he come to dinner tonight?" And Jonathan says, "Dad, he was busy. He had to go to his family to spend the festival with them, and he'll be back in a few days." And Saul, in the way he reacts to what Jonathan says, indicates what kind of a father he was before the incident happened. He takes out a sword and threatens to kill his son. Great love this father has. In other words, it's not that he wants Jonathan to sit on that throne for Jonathan's sake. He wants Jonathan to sit on that throne for his own personal ego. It'll give him nachas. He doesn't care if the son will be crucified in the process. He wants the son to sit on the throne. Jonathan, who is the one who is involved, the one who should be the king, he has given up the kingship, but the father, he is the one who insists that Jonathan is going to sit on the throne. And rather than Jonathan should cede the throne to David, he'd rather kill his son. A shene Geschäft, a wonderful father. Of course, we've never met such people. They don't exist. We've never heard such things. You haven't, I have. And here our rabbis draw a distinction between two kinds of love. And this is where our analysis of David comes home to roost, to us, individually and personally. Every love, the rabbis say, Kol ahava shehi tluya b'davar, every love, which I would now like to translate this rabbinic phrase, which depends on role-playing, davar. The word davar means a word or a thing. I want to translate this as role-playing. Any kind of interpersonal relationship which depends on role-playing, batel davar, betela ahava, when the role is no longer needed. You don't need that person for your own advancement, for your own ego satisfaction. Then the friendship and the love disintegrates. But authentic love, which does not depend upon role-playing, does not disappear forever. And what kind of love? The first kind of love, they give the love of Amnon and Tamar, a relationship described in the Bible which was a purely sexual relationship between a man and a woman. And once the sexual dimension of that relationship was fulfilled, there was no relationship left, because it was inauthentic. It was based on a role-playing. But what is the greatest of all loves? The love which is not dependent upon role-playing. Zu ahavat David v'Yonatan, the love of David and Jonathan. And our rabbis were right to see in the relationship between David and Jonathan, in spite of the fact that they themselves made David play a role for them in the interests of their own collective survival, they were right to see in this love relationship between David and Jonathan something unique precisely because it cut through role-playing. And although the reason why the rabbis chose this Haftarah today was because its opening words simply echo the fact that Macha Chodesh, tomorrow is new moon, just because of a play of words, a similarity of words, we can see a closer relationship. For new moon means renewal. It means a new start. It means a fresh look. It means self-purification. It challenges us in the light of that ideal love and interpersonal relationship of David and Jonathan, the non-role-playing interpersonal relationship to which we may aspire, even if not all of us can reach it. It challenges all of us to re-examine our relationships and our loves, parent and child, child and parent, husband and wife, wife and husband, brother and sister and brother. All our interpersonal relationships must be examined in the light of that kind of authentic divine relationship which is not dependent on any role. And all of us, as Rosh Chodesh renewal comes upon us tomorrow and the next day, need this kind of self-evaluation. Amen.